Yay. Okay, we were with Basta. Farid. Farid was running away from Basta, right? So we were with Farid's... Or we were from... we were on, like, Farid's point of view. And he was being chased by Basta and Martola, right? Or no, just Basta maybe. I don't remember, but... he was running away from them. And he was about to go find Meggie. Yeah. So... I just love their story. I don't know if I said it enough times in the first book, but I totally want them to be together. Okay, this one is from this excerpt, the little paragraph before each chapter, like it's like a foreshadowing of what's about to happen or whatever. This one's from Just So Stories by Rudyard Kipling. It's gonna be a good one. It's short, it's like one sentence. "What is this?" said the leopard. "This is so exclusively dark, and yet so full of little pieces of light." The chapter is called Dustfinger Comes Home. So, y'all get ready, because I'm getting ready. That was so hot. That's good, though. For a moment, Dustfinger felt as if he had never been away. As if he had simply had a bad dream, and the memory of it had left a stale taste on his tongue, a shadow on his heart, nothing more. All of a sudden, everything was back again. The sounds, so familiar and never forgotten, the scents, the tree trunks dappled in the morning light, the shadow of the leaves on his face. Some were turning a color, like the leaves in that other world, so autumn must be coming here too. But the air was still mild. It smelled of overripe berries, fading blossoms, 1,000 or more flowers, dazing his senses, flowers pale as wax glimmering under the shade of the trees, blue stars on stems so thin and delicate that he walked carefully so as not to tread on them, oaks, planes, tulip trees towering to the sky all around him. He had almost forgotten how huge a tree could be, how broad and tall its trunk, with a leaf canopy spreading so wide that a whole troop of horsemen could shelter beneath it. The forests of the other world were so young, their trees still children. They had always made him feel so old that the years covered him like cobwebs. Here he was young again, just like a child among the trees, not much older than the mushrooms growing among their roots, not much taller than the thistles and the nettles. But where was the boy? Dustfinger looked around, searching for him, calling his name again and again. Farid. It was the name that had become almost as familiar to him as his own over these last few months. But there was no reply, only his voice echoing back from the trees. So that was it. The boy had been left behind. What would he do all alone? Well, thought Dustfinger as he looked around in vain one last time, what do you think? He'll manage better in that world, right? He'll manage better in that world than you ever did. Okay, that's just written down. The noise, the speed, the crowds of the people, he likes all that. And you've taught him enough of your craft, he can play with fire almost as well as you. Yes, the boy will manage very well. But for a moment, the joy of his homecoming wilted in Dustfinger's heart like one of the flowers at his feet. And the morning light God. And the morning light that had welcomed him only a moment ago now seemed wan and lifeless. The other world had cheated him again. Yes, it had let him go after all those years, but it had kept the only beings there to whom he had given his heart. Well, and what does that teach you, he thought, kneeling in the dewy grass. Better to keep your heart to yourself, Dustfinger. He picked up a leaf that glowed red as fire on the dark moss. There hadn't been any leaves like that in the other world, had there? So what was the matter with him? Angry with himself, he straightened up again. Listen, Dustfinger, you're back, he told himself firmly. Back. Forget the boy. Yes, you've lost him, but you have your own world back instead, a whole world. You're back. Can you finally believe it? My eye's burning. What? Oh, it's so hot. You guys can hear okay, right? The mic's kind of far, but I'll move it if you want to be all up in my grill or whatever. Thought I saw a deer and I was gonna say moose, so that's what came out. Anyway. If only it wasn't so difficult. It was far easier to believe in unhappiness than in happiness. He would have to touch every flower, feel every tree, crumble the earth in his fingers, and feel the first gnat bite on his skin before he really believed it. But yes, he was back. He was really back at last. And suddenly happiness went to his head like a glass of strong wine. Even the thought of Farid couldn't cloud it anymore. His 10-year nightmare was over. How light he felt, light as one of the leaves raining down from the trees like gold. He was happy. Remember, Dustfinger, this is what it feels like, happiness. Sure enough, Orpheus had read him to the very place he had described. There was the pool, shimmering among the gray and white stones, surrounded by flowering oleander, and only a little way from the bank stood the plane tree where the fire elves nested. Their nest seemed to cluster more densely around the trunk than he remembered. A less practiced eye might have taken them for bees' nests, but they were smaller and rather paler, almost as pale as the park, peeling from the tall trunk to which they clung. Dustfinger looked around, once again breathing the air he had missed so much these last 10 years. Scents he had almost forgotten, mingled with those that could be found in the other world, too. And you could find trees like the ones around the pool there, too, although smaller and much younger. Branches of eucalyptus and alder reached out over the water as if to cool their leaves. Dustfinger cautiously made his way through the trees until he reached the bank. A tortoise made off at a leisurely pace when his shadow fell on its shell. The tongue of a toad sitting on a stone shot out and swallowed a fire elf. Swarms of them were whirring about over the water, with their high-pitched buzzing that always sounded so angry. It was time to raid their nests. Dustfinger kneeled down on one of the damp stones. Something rustled behind him, and for a moment he caught himself looking up for Farid's dark hair and Gwen's head with its little horns. But it was only a lizard pushing its way out of the leaves and crawling up onto one of the stones to bask in the autumn sunlight. Idiot, he muttered, leaning forward. Forget the boy. And as for the marten, he won't miss you. Anyway, you had good reasons for leaving him behind. The best of reasons. His reflection trembled on the dark water. His face was the same as ever. The scars were still there, of course, but at least he had suffered no further injuries. His nose hadn't been smashed in. He didn't have a stiff leg like Cockerel in the other story. Everything was in the right place. He even still had his voice, so the man Orpheus obviously knew his trade. Dustfinger bent lower over the water. Where were they? Had they forgotten him? The blue fairies forget every face, often just minutes after seeing it. But what about these others? 10 years is a long time, but did they count years? The water moved, and his reflection mingled with the other creatures. Toad-like eyes were looking up at him from an almost human face. With long hair drifting in the water like grass, and equally green and fine, Dustfinger took his hand out of the cool water, and another hand stretched up. A slender, delicate hand, almost like a child's, covered with scales so tiny that you could scarcely see them. A damp finger, cool as the water from which it had risen, touched his face and traced the scars on it. Yes, it's not easy to forget my face, is it? Dustfinger spoke so quietly that his voice was scarcely more than a whisper. Loud voices frighten water nymphs. So you remember the scars, and do you remember what I asked you and your sisters to do for me when I was here before? The toad-like eyes looked at him, black and gold, and then the water nymph sank and vanished as if she had been a mere illusion. But a few moments later, 3 of them appeared together in the dark water. Shoulders white as lily petals shimmered beneath the surface. Fishtails with rainbow scales like the belly of a perch flicked, barely visible in the water below. The tiny gnats dancing above the water stung Dustfinger's face and arms, as if they had been waiting just for him, but he hardly felt it. The nymphs hadn't forgotten him, neither his face nor what he needed from them to help him summon fire. They reached their hands up out of the water. Tiny air bubbles rose to the surface, the sign of their laughter. As silent as everything else about them, they took his hands between their own, stroked his arms, his face, his bare throat, until his skin was almost as cool as theirs and covered with the same fine, slimy deposit that protected their scales. Then as suddenly as they had come, they disappeared again. Their faces sank down into the dark pool, and Dustfinger might have thought, as always, that he had only dreamed them, but for the cool sensation on his skin, the shimmering of his hands and arms. "Thank you," he whispered, although only his own reflection now quivered on the water. Then he straightened up, made his way through the oleander bushes on the bank, and moved toward the fire tree as silently as possible. If Ferret had been here, he'd have been prancing through the wet grass like a foal in his excitement. I need more tea. I think all my honey is settling. Stuff doesn't stir very easy in a square cup. Who made these and why? Cobwebs wet with dew clung to his clothes as he stood under the plane tree. The lowest nests hung so far down that he could easily reach into one of the entrance holes. The first elves came swarming angrily out when he put in the fingers that the water nymphs had covered with the moist slime, but he calmed them by humming quietly. If he could hit the right note, their agitated swirling soon turned to a tumbling fight, their own humming and buzzing becoming drowsy until their tiny hot bodies settled on his arms, burning his skin and leaving a tiny deposit of soot. However much it hurt, he must not flinch, mustn't scare them away, must reach even further into the nest until he found what he was looking for, their fiery honey. Bees stung, but fire elves burned holes in your skin if the water nymphs hadn't touched it first. And even with their protection, it was prudent not to be too greedy when you stole the elves' honey. If a robber took too much, they would fly in his face, burn his skin and hair, and wouldn't let him go until he was writhing in pain at the foot of their tree. But Dustfinger was never greedy enough to annoy them. He took only a tiny piece of honeycomb from the nest, scarcely larger than his thumbnail. That was all he needed for now. He went on humming quietly as he wrapped the honey in some leaves. The fire elves woke as soon as he stopped humming. They whirred around him faster and faster while their voices rose to a sound like bumblebees buzzing angrily. However, they did not attack him. You had to ignore them, act as if you hadn't even seen them as you turned and walked away at your leisure, slowly, very slowly. They went on whirling in the air around Dustfinger for some time, but in the end they fell behind him and he followed the small stream that flowed out of the water nymph's pool and wound slowly away through the willows, reeds, and alders. She's snoring so loud. He knew where the stream would take him, out of the wayless wood, where you hardly ever met another soul of your own kind, and then on northward to places where the forest belonged to human beings, and its timber fell to their axes so fast that most trees died before their canopies could offer shelter to so much as a single horseman. The stream would lead him through the valley as it slowly opened out, past hills where no man had ever set foot because they were full of giants and bears and creatures that had never been given a name. At some point, the first charcoal burners' huts would appear on the slopes. Dustfinger would see the first patch of bare earth among the dense green, and then he would be reunited not just with fairies and water nymphs, but he hoped with some of those human beings he had missed for so long. He moved into cover when a sleepy wolf appeared between two trees in the distance and waited, motionless, until its gray muzzle had disappeared. Yes, bears and wolves. He must learn to listen for their steps again, to sense their presence nearby before they saw him, not forgetting the big wildcats, dappled like tree trunks in the sunlight, and the snakes as green as the foliage where they liked to hide. They would themselves... What? I feel like they're missing words. They would themselves down from branches. Dangle? I feel like it's missing dangle. They would dangle themselves down from the branches with less sound than his hand would make, brushing a leaf off his shoulder. Luckily, the giants generally stayed in their hills, where not even he dared go. Only in winter did they sometimes come home. But there were other creatures too, being less gentle than the water nymphs, and they couldn't be lulled by humming as the fire elves could. They were usually invisible, well hidden among timber and green leaves, but they were no less dangerous for that. Treemen, trolls, black boggles, nightmares, some of them even ventured as far as the charcoal burners' huts. Take a little more care, Dustfinger whispered to himself. You don't want your first day home to be your last. The sheer intoxication of being back gradually died down, allowing him to think more clearly again, but the happiness remained in his heart, soft and warm like a young bird's downy plumage. He took off his clothes beside a stream and washed the water nymph's slimy deposit off his body, together with the fire elf's soot and the grime of the other world. Then he put on the clothes he hadn't worn for 10 years. He had looked after them carefully, but there were a few moth holes in the black fabric all the same, and the sleeves had already been threadbare when he first took them off in that other world. These garments were all red and black, the colors worn by fire eaters, just as tightrope walkers clothed themselves in the blue of the sky. He stroked the rough material, put on the full-sleeved doublet, and then threw the dark cloak over his shoulders. I don't know what's a doublet, and it might be doublet, but I don't know. And threw the dark cloak over his shoulders. Luckily, everything was still fitted. Everything still fitted. Fit. Just say fit. Getting new clothes made was an expensive business, even if you just took your old clothes to the tailor to be patched up again, as the strolling players usually did. When twilight fell, he looked around for a safe place to sleep. Finally, he climbed up onto a fallen oak with its root ball towering so high in the air that it offered good shelter for the night. The root ball was like a great rampart of earth, yet some of the roots still clung to the ground, as if unwilling to let go of life. The crown of the fallen tree had put out new shoots, although they now pointed to the ground and not the sky. Dustfinger nimbly clambered along the mighty trunk, digging his fingers into the rough bark. When he reached the roots, where they were now thrusting up into the air as if they could find nourishment there, a few fairies flew up, chattering crossly. They had obviously been looking for the building materials for their nests. Of course, it would soon be autumn, time for more weatherproof sleeping places. The blue fairies took no particular trouble over the nests they built in the spring, but as soon as the first leaf turned color, they began improving them, padding them with animal fur and birds' feathers, weaving more grass and twigs into the walls, sealing cracks with moss and fairy spit. Two of the tiny blue creatures didn't fly away when they saw him. They stared avidly at his sandy hair as the evening light falling through the treetops tinged their wings with red. Ah, of course, Dustfinger laughed softly. You want some of my hair for your nests. He cut off a lock with his knife. One of the delighted fairies seized the hair in her delicate, insect-like hands and fluttered quickly away with it. The other fairy, so tiny that she could only have just hatched from her mother-of-pearl egg, followed her. He had missed those bold little blue creatures. He'd missed them so much. Down below, among the trees, night was falling. But in the light of the setting sun, the treetops overhead were turning red as sorrel in the summer meadow. Soon the fairies would be asleep in their nests, the mice and rabbits in their holes and burrows. The cool of the night would make the lizards' legs stiff, and the birds would fall silent. Predators would prepare to go hunting, their eyes like yellow lights in the darkness. Let's hope they don't fancy a fire eater for dinner, thought Dustfinger, stretching his legs out on the fallen trunk. He thrust his knife into the cracked bark beside him, wrapped himself in the cloak he hadn't worn for 10 years, and stared up at the leaves. They were growing darker and darker now. An owl rose from an oak and swooped away, little more than a shadow among the branches. A tree whispered in his sleep, words that no human ear could understand. Dustfinger closed his eyes and listened. He was home again. Oh, man. My chat's dark. No. Nobody's here. Okay, sometimes at the end of a chapter, that will have like a little ink splotch of a picture. This is supposed to be a water nymph, I think. It looks kind of scary. So, where did I want to get to? Oh, it's just a long chapter. So yeah, one more chapter is like a whole nother 15 pages. I think I'm gonna go ahead and read it though. It's just gonna be a good minute. It's like on average around 2 minutes per page if I'm not a stuttering mess that day. So it's gonna be like half an hour. I just got that everywhere. Like all my honey's at the bottom. Stir. It's trying. Okay, we're switching back to Maggie's point of view. It's called Silvertongue's Daughter, which means maybe Ferret's gonna find her. Because I know that's who he was going to go find last. And then hopefully they get back together here. Like the group, I mean, not Maggie and Ferret. I mean, hopefully, but you know. Okay, this little tiny little foreshadowing thingy is from The Subtle Knife by Philip Pullman. Was there only one world after all, which spent its time dreaming of others? That's it. Maggie hated quarreling with Mo. It left her shaking inside, and nothing could comfort her. Not a hug from her mother, not the licorice candies Reese's Aunt Eleanor gave her if their loud voices had carried to the library. Not Darius, who firmly believed in the miraculous healing powers of hot milk and honey in such cases. Nothing helped. This time it had been particularly bad, because Mo had really only come to see her to say goodbye. He had a new job waiting, some sick books too old and valuable to be sent to him. In the past, Maggie would have gone with him, but this time she had decided to stay with Eleanor and her mother. Why did he have to come to her room just when she was reading notebooks again? They'd often quarreled over those notebooks recently, although Mo hated a quarrel as much as she did. Afterwards, he usually disappeared into the workshop that Eleanor had built behind the house for him, had built behind the house for him, and a time would come once Maggie couldn't bear to be angry with him anymore, when she would follow him there. I keep reading stupid. I'm like, I don't know, these sentences just don't seem to be going where they're going, you know? Y'all don't get how kind of difficult it is to read out loud. Like, you don't know where the sentence is going to end. You don't know how to read it because you don't know what it's going to do. And then when you start reading ahead, like with your eyes, you start reading stupid because you're like skipping stuff and just whatever. Y'all don't know my struggle. He never raised his head when she slipped through the doorway, and without a word, Maggie would sit down beside him on the chair that was always ready for her and watch him at work, just as she had done even before she could read. She loved watching his hands free a book from its shabby dress, separate stained pages from each other, part the threads holding together a damaged quire, or soak rag paper to mend a sheet of paper worn thin. It was never long before Mo turned and asked her a question of some kind. Did she like the color he'd chosen for a linen binding? Did she agree that the paper pulp he'd mixed for repairs had turned out slightly too dark? It was Mo's way of apologizing, of saying, "Don't let's quarrel, Meggie. Let's forget what we just said now." But that was no good today, because he hadn't disappeared into his workshop. He'd gone away to see some book collector or other and give the collector's printed treasures a new lease on life. This time he wouldn't come to her with a present to make up for the quarrel, a book he'd found in a secondhand bookshop somewhere, or a bookmark decorated with blue jay feathers found in Eleanor's garden. So why couldn't she have been reading some other book when he came into her room? "Good heavens, Meggie, you seem to have nothing in your head but those notebooks," he said angrily. It had been the same every time, these last few months. Whenever he had found her like that in her room, lying on the rug, deaf and blind to all that went on around her, eyes glued to the words with which she had written down with Glued to the words with which she had written down what Risa told her. Tales of what she had seen there, as Mo bitterly called it. There. Inkworld was the name Meggie gave to the place of which Mo spoke so slightingly, and her mother sometimes with such longing. Inkworld, after the book about it, Inkheart. The book was gone, but her mother's memories were as vivid as if not a day had passed since she was there. In that world of paper and printer's ink, where there were fairies and princes, water nymphs, fire elves, and the trees that seemed to grow to the sky, Meggie had sat with her mother for countless days and nights, writing down what Risa's fingers told her. Risa had left her voice behind in the ink world, so she talked to her daughter either with pencil and paper or with her hands, telling the story of those years. Those terrible magical years, she called them. Sometimes she also drew what her eyes had seen, but her tongue could no longer describe. Fairies, birds, strange flowers conjured up on paper with just a few strokes, yet looking so real that Meggie almost believed she had seen them too. At first, Mo had bound the notebooks in which Meggie wrote down Risa's memories. Each binding was more beautiful than the last, but a time came when Meggie noticed the anxiety in his eyes as he watched her reading them, completely absorbed in the words and pictures. Of course she understood his uneasiness. After all, for years he had lost his wife to this world made of words and paper. How could he like it if his daughter thought of little else? Oh yes, Meggie understood Mo very well, yet she couldn't do as he asked. Close the books and forget the ink world for a while. Perhaps her longing for it wouldn't have been quite as strong if the fairies and brownies had still been around. All those strange creatures they had brought back from Capricorn's accursed village. But none of them lived in Eleanor's gardens now. The fairies' empty nests still clung to the trees, and the burrows that the brownies had dug were still there, but their inhabitants were gone. At first, Eleanor thought they had run away or been stolen, but then the ashes had been found. They covered the grass and garden, fine as dust, gray ashes, as gray as the shadows from which Eleanor's strange guests had once appeared. And Meggie had realized that there was no return from death, even for creatures made of nothing but words. Eleanor, however, could not reconcile herself to this idea. Defiantly, desperately, she had driven back to Capricorn's village, only to find the streets empty, the houses burned down, and not a living soul in sight. "You know, Eleanor," Mo had said when she came back with her face tear-stained, "I was afraid of something like this. I couldn't really believe there were words to bring back the dead. And besides, if you're honest with yourself, you must admit they didn't fit into this world." Nor do I, was all Eleanor had replied. Over the next few weeks, Maggie had often heard sobbing from Eleanor's room when she slipped into the library one last time in the evening to find a book. Many months had passed since then. They had all been living together in Eleanor's big house for nearly a year, and Maggie had a feeling that Eleanor was glad not to be alone with her books anymore. She had given them the best rooms. Eleanor's old school books and a few writers she no longer much liked had been banished to the attic to make more space. Maggie's room had a view of snow-topped mountains, and from her parents' bedroom you could see the distant lake with its gleaming water, which had so often tempted the fairies to fly in that direction. Mo had never simply gone off like that before. Without a word of goodbye, without making up the quarrel. Perhaps I should go down and help Darius in the library, thought Maggie as she sat there wiping the tears from her face. She never cried while she was quarreling with Mo. The tears didn't come until later, and he always looked terribly guilty when he saw her red eyes. She was sure that yet again everyone had heard them quarreling. Darius was probably making a hot milk and honey already, and as soon as she put her head around the kitchen door, Eleanor would begin calling Mo and men in general names. No, she'd better stay in her own room. Oh, Mo, he had snatched the notebook he was reading out of her hand and taken it with him. And that one was the book where she had collected the ideas for stories of her own, beginnings that had never gotten any further, opening words, crossed out sentences, all her failed attempts. How could he just take it away from her? She didn't want Mo to read it, didn't want him seeing how she tried in vain to fit the words together on paper, words that came to her tongue so easily with such power when she read aloud. Maggie could write down what Risa described to her. She could fill pages and pages with the stories her mother told her. But as soon as she tried to make something new of them, a story with life of its own, her mind went blank. Oh my goodness! Whew. Me too, Lilac. Me too. The words seemed to fly out of her head, like snowflakes leaving only a damp patch on your skin when you put out...
You can do it, Milo.
Hey, thanks, Diaper. Again, you donated earlier too, huh? Thank you. I'm so yawny. Someone knocked on Maggie's door. Come in, she snuffled, looking in her trouser pockets for one of the old-fashioned handkerchiefs that Eleanor had given her. They belonged to my sister. Her name began with an M, like yours, embroidered in the corner there. See? I thought it would be better for you to have them than let the moths eat holes in them. Her mother put her head around the door. Maggie tried to smile, but it was a miserable failure. Can I come in? Risa's fingers traced the words in the air faster than Darius could have said them aloud. Maggie nodded. By now she understood her mother's sign language almost as easily as the letters of the alphabet. She knew it better than Mo, and much better than Eleanor, who had often called for Maggie in desperation when Risa's fingers went too fast for her. Risa closed the door behind her and sat on the windowsill with her daughter. Maggie always called her mother by her first name, perhaps because she hadn't had a mother for 10 years, or perhaps because, for the same inexplicable reason, she had always called her father just Mo. Maggie recognized the notebook as soon as Risa put it on her lap. It was the one that Mo had taken. I found it lying outside your door, said her mother's hands. Maggie stroked the patterned binding. So Mo had brought it back. Why hadn't he come in? Because he was still too angry, or because he was sorry? I'm gonna turn that off. My furnace just came on. Woo, goose! Oh, there's a whole line of them. nice toasty puppy, huh? I feel like she goes outside in the morning and sees the temperature and then just decides to sleep for the rest of the day or not after that. Like, I don't know what else, but it seems pretty accurate. Where was I? Why hadn't he come in? Because he was still too angry or because he was sorry? He wants me to put them away in the attic, at least for a while. Maggie suddenly felt so small, and at the same time so old. He said, perhaps I ought to turn into a glass man or dye my skin blue, since my wife and daughter obviously think more of fairies and glass men than of me. Risa smiled and stroked Maggie's nose with her forefinger. Yes, I know of course he doesn't really think that, but he always gets so angry when he sees me with the notebooks. Risa looked out through the open window. Eleanor's garden was so large that you couldn't see where it began or ended. You just saw tall trees and flower shrubs so old that they surrounded Eleanor's house like an evergreen wood. See, that's what I want. That's what I want. Yeah. Yeah. I want Eleanor's house. That's not too much to ask, is it? But by a beach. Hers is in the mountains of Italy. That's not too bad. Right under Maggie's window was a lawn with a narrow gravel path around it. A garden seat stood to one side of the lawn. Maggie still remembered the night when she had sat there watching Dustfinger breathe fire. Eleanor's ever-grumpy gardener had swept the dead leaves off the lawn only that afternoon. You could still see the bare patch in the middle where Capricorn's men had burned Eleanor's best books. The gardener kept trying to persuade Eleanor to plant something in that space, or to sow more grass seed there, but Eleanor just shook her head energetically. Who grows grass on a grave? She had snapped the last time he suggested it, and she told him to leave the yarrow alone, too. It had grown luxuriantly around the sides of the blackened patch ever since the fire, as if to make its flat flower heads a reminder of the night when Eleanor's printed children were swallowed up by the flames. Flames. Yeah, it's thick. The sun was setting behind the nearby mountain, so red that it was as if it too wanted to remind them of that long extinguished fire, and a cool wind blew from the hills, making Risa shiver. Maggie closed the window. The wind blew a few faded rose petals against the pane. They stuck to the glass, pale yellow and translucent. I don't want to quarrel with him, she whispered. I never used to quarrel with Mo. Well, almost never. Perhaps he's right, her mother pushed back her hair. It was just as long as Maggie's, but darker, as if a shadow had fallen on it. Risa usually held it back with combs. Maggie often wore her hair like that too, and sometimes when she looked at her reflection in the mirror, she seemed to be seeing not herself, but a younger version of her mother. Another year and she'll be towering over you, Mo sometimes said when he wanted to tease Risa, and the short-sighted Darius had confused Maggie with her mother several times already. Risa ran her forefinger over the window pane, as if tracing the rose petals that clung to it. Then her hands began speaking again. Hesitantly, just as lips can sometimes hesitate. I do understand your father, Maggie, she said. Sometimes I myself think the two of us talk about that other world too often. Even I don't understand why I keep coming back to the subject, and I'm always telling you about what was beautiful there, not the other things. Being shut up. Mortola's punishments, how my hands and knees hurt so much from all the work that I couldn't sleep, all the cruelty I saw there. Did I tell you about the maid who died of fright because a nightmare stole into our bedroom? Yes, you did. Maggie moved very close to her mother, but Reese's hands fell silent. They were still roughened from all her years of toil as a maid, working first for Mortola and then for Capricorn. You've told me about everything, said Maggie, the bad things too, even if Mo won't believe it. But all the same, he feels that we dream of only the wonderful part, as if I ever had much of that. Risa shook her head, and again her fingers fell silent for a long time before she let them go. I had to steal it for myself in seconds, minutes, sometimes a precious hour when we were allowed out in the forest to gather the plants Mortola needed for her black potions. But there were the years when you were free to. When you disguised yourself and worked in the markets as a scribe. Disguised as a man, Maggie had pictured it over and over again. Her mother with her hair cut short, wearing a scribe's tunic, ink on her fingers from the finest handwriting to be found in the ink world. So Risa had told her. It was the way she had earned a living in a world that didn't make it easy for women to work. And this is tea. Maggie would have liked to hear the story again now. What did I just see? Oh. Even if it had a sad ending, for after that, Risa's years of unhappiness had begun. But wonderful things had happened during that time too, like the great banquet at the Laughing Prince's castle to which Mortola had taken her maids, the banquet where Risa saw the Laughing Prince himself and the Black Prince and his bear, the tightrope walker called Cloud Dancer, but Risa hadn't come into her room to tell all those stories again. She said nothing in reply, and when her fingers did begin to speak once more, they moved more slowly than usual. Forget the ink world, Maggie, they said. Let both of us forget, and at least for a little while, for your father's sake, and for yours, or one day you may be blind to the beauty around you here. She looked out of the window again at the gathering dusk. I've told you all about it already, said her hands, everything you wanted to know. So she had, and Maggie had asked her many questions, thousands and thousands of them. Did you ever see one of the giants? What sort of clothes did you wear? What did the fortress look like? In that forest where Mortola took you? And that prince you talk about, the Laughing Prince? Was his castle as huge and magnificent as the Castle of Night? Tell me about his son, Cosimo the Fair, and the Adderhead, and his men at arms. Was everything in his castle really made of silver? How big is the bear that the Black Prince always keeps beside him? And what about the trees? Can they really talk? And that old woman, the one they all call Nettle, is it true that she could fly? Risa had answered all these questions as well as she could, but even 1,000 answers did not add up to a whole 10 years. And there were some questions that Maggie had never put to her. She had never asked about Dustfinger, for instance, but Risa had talked about him all the same, telling her that everyone in the ink world knew his name, even many years after he had disappeared. Of course he was known as the Fire Dancer too, so Risa had recognized him once she met him for the first time in this world. There was another question that Maggie didn't ask, although it often came into her mind, for Risa couldn't have answered it. What about Finoglio, the writer of the book that had drawn first her mother and finally even its own author into its pages? How is Finoglio now? More than a year had passed since Maggie's voice had cast the spell of Finoglio's own words over him, and he had disappeared as if they had swallowed him up. Sometimes Maggie saw his wrinkled face in her dreams, but she never knew if it looked sad or happy. Not that it had been easy to read the expression on Finoglio's tortoise-like face anyway. One night when she woke suddenly from one of these dreams and couldn't get to sleep again, she had begun a story in which Finoglio was trying to write himself home again, back to his grandchildren in the village where Maggie had first met him, but as with all the other stories he'd started to write, she never got past the first 3 sentences. Maggie leafed through the notebook that Mo had taken away from her, then closed it again. Risa put a hand under her chin and looked into her face. Don't be cross with him. I never am, not for long. He knows that. How much longer will he be away? 10 days, maybe more. 10 days? Maggie looked at the shelf beside her bed. There they were, neatly arranged side by side, the bad books, as she secretly called them, full of Risa's stories, tales of glass men and water nymphs, fire elves, nightmares, white women, and all the other strange creatures that her mother had described. That's kind of funny. Alright, I'll phone him and say he can make them a box, but I'll keep the key to it. Risa dropped a kiss on her forehead, then she carefully passed her hand over the notebook in Maggie's lap. Does anyone in the world bind books more beautifully than your father? Her fingers asked. Maggie shook her head with a smile. No, she whispered, no one in this world or any other. When Risa went downstairs again to help Darius and Eleanor with supper, Maggie stayed by the window to watch Eleanor's garden filling with shadows. When a squirrel scurried over the lawn, its bushy tail stretched out behind it, and she was reminded of Dustfinger's tame Martin Gwyn. How strange that she now understood the yearning that she had often seen on his master's scarred face. Yes, Mo was probably right. She thought about Dustfinger's world too much, far too much. She had even read some of Risa's stories aloud a few times, although she didn't know how dangerous her voice could be when it spoke the words on the page. Hadn't she, to be perfectly honest, more honest than people usually are, hadn't she cherished a secret hope that the words would take her to that world? What would Mo have done if he'd known about these experiments? Would he have buried the notebooks in the garden or thrown them into the lake, as he sometimes threatened to do with the stray cats that stole into his workshop? Yes, I'll lock them away, thought Maggie as the first stars appeared outside. As soon as Mo has made them a new box, with her favorite books in it was... The box with her favorite books in it was crammed full now. It was red as poppies. Mo had only recently repainted it. The box for the notebooks must be a different color. Perhaps green like the wayless wood that Risa had described so often. Yes, green. And didn't the guards outside the Laughing Prince's castle wear green cloaks too? A moth fluttered against the window, reminding Maggie of the blue-skinned fairies and the best of all the stories that Risa had told her about them. How they healed Dustfinger's face after Basta slashed it, in gratitude to him for the many times he had freed their sisters from the wire cages where peddlers imprisoned them to be sold at market as good luck charms. And deep in the wayless wood Nope, that's enough. Maggie leaned her forehead against the cool pane. Quite enough. I'll take them all to Mo's workshop, she thought, at once, and when he's back, I'll ask him to buy me a new notebook for stories about this world of ours. She had already begun to write some. About Eleanor's garden and her library, about the castle down by the lake. Robbers had once lived there. Eleanor had told her about them in her own typical storytelling style, with so many grisly details that Darius, listening, forgot to go on sorting books, and his eyes widened in horror behind his thick glasses. What's up, Manny? I'm not sure what that means. Does it mean what are you reading? I'm reading Inkspell by Cornelia Funk. It's book number 2 in the Ink Heart trilogy. So there's 3. We're almost done with this today. Dang, it really did take like 30 minutes too. Maggie, slipper time. Eleanor's call echoed right to the top of the stairs. She had a very powerful voice, louder than the Titanic's foghorn, Mo always said. Maggie slipped off the windowsill. Coming, she called down the corridor, then she went back into her room, took the notebooks off the shelf one by one, until her arms could hardly hold the stack, and carried the precarious pile down the corridor and into the room that Mo used as an office. It had once been Maggie's bedroom. She had slept there when she first came to Eleanor's house with Mo and Dustfinger. But all you could see from this window was the gravel forecourt, some spruce trees, a large chestnut, and Eleanor's gray station wagon, which stood outdoors in all weather, because it was more Eleanor's opinion that cars living in luxury in a garage rusted more quickly. But when they had decided to come and live there, Maggie had wanted a window with a view of the garden. So Mo, surrounded by Eleanor's collection of old travel guides, did his paperwork in the room where Maggie had slept before she ever went to Capricorn's village. when she still had no mother and almost never quarreled with Mo. "Maggie, where are you?" Eleanor's voice sounded impatient. Her joints often ached these days, but she refused to go to the doctor. "What's the point?" was her only comment. "They haven't invented a pill to cure old age, have they?" I love Eleanor. I love Eleanor so much. She's freaking awesome. "I'll be down in a minute," called Maggie, carefully lowering the notebooks onto Mo's desk. Two of them slipped off the pile and almost knocked over the vase of autumn flowers that her mother had put by the window. Maggie caught it just before the water spilled over Mo's invoices and receipts for gasoline. She was standing there with the vase still in her hand, her fingers sticky with drifting pollen, when she saw the figure between the trees where the path came up from the road. Her heart began to thud so hard that the vase almost slipped out of her fingers again. Well, that just went to prove it. Mo was right. "Maggie, take your head out of those books, or soon you won't know the difference between reality and your imagination." He'd told her that so often, and now it was happening. She'd been thinking about Dustfinger only a moment ago, hadn't she? And now she saw someone standing out there in the night, just like the time, more than a year ago, when she'd seen Dustfinger waiting outside her house, motionless as the figure she saw there at this moment. "Maggie, for heaven's sake, how many more times do I have to call you?" Eleanor was wheezing from climbing all the stairs. "What are you doing, standing there rooted to the spot? Didn't you say—" "Good heavens, who's that?" "You can see him too." Maggie was so relieved she could have hugged Eleanor. "Of course I can." The figure moved. Barefoot, it ran over the pale gravel. "It's the boy." It's that boy." Eleanor sounded incredulous. "The one who helped that matchstick eater steal the book from your father. Well, he's got nerve, turning up here. He looks somewhat worse for fear. For wear. Does he think I'm going to let him in? I dare say the matchstick eater's out there too." Eleanor came closer to the window, looking anxious, but Maggie was already out the door. She ran downstairs and raced through the entrance hall. Her mother came along the corridor leading to the kitchen. "Risa," Maggie called. "Farid's here. It's Farid." Speaking of Farid, I guess the next foreshadowing, I'm just going to go ahead and read it, even though I'll read it next time. It's from the War of the Buttons, and it says, "He was stubborn as a mule, clever as a monkey, and nimble as a hare." Chapter 5, Farid. But anyways, we're done reading for today. That was a good, probably about an hour, so...